Hello, everybody, and welcome to the European Marine Board's third Thursday Science Webinar series. My name is Sheila Heymans. I'm the Executive Director of the Marine Board, and I am your moderator today. So the webinar is being live streamed. You might have heard that, and it will be made available on our Marine Board website, so you can watch it again there. Some housekeeping rules for those of you that are online. Please make sure that we've got your name clearly written so that when you ask a question, we know who you are. Please make sure that you use the Q&A, which should be at the bottom of your screen, to ask those questions, and let us know which organization and country you're from when you do, so that we also can introduce your question well. I will read through the questions and answer them to the speaker, ask them to the speaker for her to answer. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function and we will help, try and help you if possible, if needed. So the science that we'll be discussing today is the science that's behind our one of our new documents on the European offshore renewable energy towards a sustainable future. Basically, the focus is on the ecosystem effects of offshore wind farms. Understanding and using it for sustainable development. Our speaker today is Beth Scott. She's a professor in marine ecology at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and she will be giving us the talk on her science. So I will stop sharing, and Beth, if you can start sharing, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay. Get it up in.
Yep, we've got it. And if you can put it in full screen mode.
There we go. Is that
perfect? Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Sheila. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here to listen to this. So yes, this is an aspect of that report, the aspect that I worked on about ecosystem effects of offshore winds. And I hope by the end of this talk, we will provide some reasoning and some methods on how we can better understand them and use them for a more sustainable future. Because I put this image up, I'm sure it's not a shock to all of you, but maybe to some of you, how much of our oceans we're starting to use. And possibly this is still just the start, that we're going to use a lot more, so that we're going to end up with thousands of pylons, or in the deeper water, jackets and floating wind infrastructure. So this is going to extract over hundreds and hundreds of gigawatts is what is anticipated. Right now for 2050, it's somewhere between 300 and 400 gigawatts of wind energy extraction out of the North Sea alone. And for perspective, 2 gigawatts is usually what a nuclear plant produces. So huge amounts coming out. So how do we deal with this? Oops, trying to get my slides to change here. There we go. How have we dealt with, how to do it well and how to make sure we're using our spaces well? Well, of course, we went to the law as to what is the law about how we use our oceans. And this is a wonderful paper called the Horrendogram of all the international laws. And what happens with these laws is that most of the regulations make you focus on one thing at a time. So it's really hard to do ecosystem approaches. So what I've produced, because I've worked a lot with engineers as well, is trying to take all of that horrendogram and bring it down, especially in the environmental impacts, bring it to something simpler. So I call it the 3Ds of environmental impacts. And in increasing order here, the main impacts we look at are disturbance. This is just this idea of noise or boats or whatever can disturb animals, move them away for just a while out of where they want to be, and then they can come back fairly quickly. Now, if that happens once or twice, who cares? It probably doesn't matter. But if it happens every day for months on end, it's going to matter, and we need to keep track of that. The next bigger one is displacement that we do see happening. So this is sort of an old picture of some radar images of birds flying around mostly wind farms, so avoiding wind farms. So even though that's great, they're avoiding, so there's not the collision risk. That means that they're not getting to use this area. Therefore, they're displaced out of an area where they might be foraging. And we're seeing evidence of this in Germany with divers or loons, as I call them. But also the fishing industry. The fishing industry is going to be displaced out of most of these wind farms. So that has to be thought about. And then, of course, the worst one is death. the idea that there are collisions, and there are collisions, and some species are more susceptible than others, and not just birds, but also bats. And I'm showing a porpoise here, but that's actually death by a seal, that porpoise. But the worry about underwater turbines as well, thinking about that. So basically, a lot of these animals are long-lived animals. If you start killing off adults, the populations will actually tumble quite quickly. So that has been a massive focus. But what's happened then is, as we get to this scale where we got these massive amounts of things coming into our space, and we start to look at, we have to do cumulative impact, of course, an analogy to ecosystems, we realize that the trophic levels are interacting with each other, and you can't actually just add up across species like this. It just doesn't work when you're trying to combine everything. So we need a better approach. And so that's why, I've been pushing for years now to really try to look at ecosystems. And the pushback is that ecosystems are complicated. We don't understand them yet. But I think, and I see it with colleagues here, with an example from some years ago now of our Dutch colleagues, this lovely, fairly simple to interpret diagram of all the different things that could be going on and where offshore wind fits in there. This accepting that things are all connected, and then trying to use our knowledge about how ecosystems function to move forward. And you can see in this diagram, you start to look at what wind is going to change. You realize it's changing a lot of the things of the physics, the currents, the wind, the wave, and then it gets over into the far side before you start getting into these animals that have spent most of the focus has been on them. So absolutely, there's a huge amount in this new report that the EABM has put out, and I'm one of the authors. So I absolutely recommend to go and look at that, about all the kinds of background we've put in, and the ecosystem part is just a small bit of some of the chapters. And also what I wanted to highlight is there's just been a blossom of papers coming out in the last year or so about really how to integrate ecosystem approaches and how they link across with MSFD and GES policies, a good environmental status, and that we should be looking at this. And so I'm shamelessly plugging one that our group just put out about a week ago as well. So the outline of what I'm going to take you through in the rest of this talk is really then to understand ecosystems and how to make our futures hopefully more sustainable, is first to understand how ecosystems function. And I'm going to tell you that there's three main drivers. And then we're going to look at how offshore winds actually affect ecosystems. And the takeaway message is that it's mixing and primary production, bottom-up effect. And then I'm going to dig into how understandings of areas of new primary production leads to predictability and fish availability. And that can help with our mammals and birds as well. And I'm going to end with an example of a new project we're running in the program called EcoWind. And the project itself is called Pelagio, and show all of our new methodologies of at-sea sampling, oceanographic ecosystem models, and how we're looking at scenario testing. So to start, these bottom-up drivers of ecosystems. So you can look around the world at a lot of review papers now looking at different types of ecosystems, but here, shallow seas ecosystem, it's pretty consistent around the world. One of the main drivers is bottom-up climatic effects, affecting plankton, and the drive of plankton up through our trophic webs, one of the most important drivers of them all. The next one, though, up is the planktivorous fish. These are fish, the plankton-eating fish, such as herring, sprat, sand eels, and mackerel. These really, low number of species, but so important that they are transferring all of the biomass of the plankton and copepods up through to the other bigger animals and the commercial fishes. Very complex, but very important. And then there's another effect, of course. We are fishing hard enough that we do see that fishing pressure coming down through as a direct, one of the drivers, the anthropogenic drivers of marine ecosystems. And that also, though, it does seem to have then an indirect effect with plankton. So the effects of wind farms. Well, the Germans, in fact, being a group led by Corina Schrum, have been at this for a while now, looking at these 3 different months of June, July, August, is that there are, by extracting the wind out, the wind energy out, you are actually changing the level of mixing. And what we're showing here is the level of stratification. And I'll talk about that quite a bit in a minute. But warm water above cold water, and they're using this thing called potential energy anomaly, which is the amount of energy it takes to mix the whole water column up. is the easier way to think about it. And essentially, why we're so worried about the extraction of wind energy is that it is doing this level of mixing. And what I was a participant of COP26, and I heard a lot of financial people talking about free, that the wind energy is free. And it's not free in the sense that that wind energy would have gone on to do something ecological, i.e. mix the surface of our oceans. And you'll see how important that is in a minute. So trade-offs, this is one of the ways that offshore winds are affecting. The other way is under the water, then, these bottom-up changes. So it's like the oceanographic community just woke up to all this about 5 or 6 years ago, and all this stuff is starting to come out now. Because I know when I first started looking at a lot of these things, a lot of the oceanographers would say, Beth, it's the sun and the moon. You're not changing that. It's not going to change. But now the realization of the scale of this, and also that we're going to put these structures out now away from near shores, out into much more stratified water. And you'll see how important that is in a second. This where you've got warm water above cold water, and you've got things sitting right next to what's called the thermocline or pycnocline, where a lot of exciting biology happens. Then they realized it actually is going to change things. But in this sense, actually, the prediction at the moment is it might produce more plankton, that it might be really good in terms of producing good plankton, edible plankton. So the jury is out as to actually what's going to happen. But both things, both extraction of wind energy and the structures under the water, might actually change production. And so why this is important, so I'll do a little bit for those of you who may not be oceanographers, and these are produced by one of my PhD students, Ariana Zampolo, these wonderful animations of showing what the water column looks like. You usually have this density of water, this black line coming down through the water column, and then on the x-axis is how at the intensity of it. And what you have then in the middle is what we're calling the pycnocline, where you've got the top of the mid-layer mixed layer depth, and then the bottom of the mixed layer depth. And in there is your pycnocline. And why that's important is because that's usually where your maximum chlorophyll, where your plankton is. It usually sits within that pycnocline, within the mixed layer depth at some point. And what can happen is there can be a real change of where that mixed layer depth is, how mixed it is, and therefore that could have a big effect on the amount of plankton because of this different vertical distribution. It can also affect the phenology, the timing of when the blooms happen. And very importantly, it could affect the communities. There's thousands of species of plankton out there. You give them a little bit different mixing conditions, you'll get different types of species coming through. And then there's also areas where it mixes so much all the time via tides that you have these areas that are completely mixed. So on the left-hand side here, what you see is we've put together with some outputs from this wonderful paper, we've overlaid them with the current wind farms, and the different colors then, this blue color is representing these permanently mixed areas where there's no difference from top to bottom in your water column. The pink ones are the intermediate, what we were looking at before, and then the green ones out in the middle there where we don't have wind farms yet are these highly stratified areas where mostly possibly floating wind is going to go, and where you have high levels of stratification. So if offshore wind farms affect the vertical distribution of plankton, then it's likely that populations of phytoplankton, the abundance will change, and also this vertical position of where plankton is will change, and that can change the availability of food to predators. And then that links predator and prey associations, and that is going to be the link up to ecosystems. So one of the things we really want to focus in on is after the spring bloom. We have this big spring bloom that starts in April or early in some places, lasts for about 6 to 8 weeks. There's sort of plankton all through the water column. We got plankton soup. Everybody's happy, eating away. But then after that, most of the rest of the summer and into the fall, you have this, all your planktons down at this thermocline, pycnocline, showing in this picture. And there are estimates that 50% of the subsurface chlorophyll is produced, or 50% of the year's plankton productions is from this layer. The assumption was it's everywhere, right? Wherever it's stratified, it's where, but it's not. It's patchy, and we've now known that for a while. So I'll take you through this complicated slide of some of our research from some years ago, where we went out to investigate where animals were actually feeding. And what we're showing here is some of the transects lines on the left-hand side of where we were, and then on the right, you're seeing the one of the transects, And what you're seeing a color in the water column there above the bathymetry is chlorophyll, fluorescence, so the amount of plankton in the water column. And then what we did is we said, actually, we don't want to know everything about every individual species, although as interesting as that is, we actually just want to see, are there generalities across these top predators like puffins and minke whales and things. So we put them all together as a super predator, and then we looked at where were they in relation to this chlorophyll. And what was incredibly interesting was that indeed, that's where you saw a lot of your animals, was over this major chlorophyll. And that in fact, it was like there's a threshold. It's not a big level, but there is a minimum level about which they are. And also please note that at the surface of this, you won't see anything. There's no surface signal, so satellites do not pick this up. So what we also did then is we did some experiments with the tides in this area to really understand what might be the drivers of how animals are interacting with the physics. And so what we did is we went around in circles every 2 hours and 5 minutes so that we could look at the tides every 2 hours as they're changing. We call them, increasing ebb. So these complicated panels you're looking at in front, the top panels are the number of actively foraging kittiwakes. The middle panel is the acoustic output from our EK60s, I'll explain that in a second, of sand eel schools that you see in the water column. And then the bottom one is the same as you saw before, the bathymetry with the fluorescence in it. And what we do is then we go around and every 2 hours, or 2 hours and 5 minutes actually to be exact, and we look at what the behavior of these animals are across all the trophic chains. And what we see in an increasing ebb where we're below 85% of the tidal speed of that system, you're seeing regular sand eel schools. We come back 2 hours later to the same spot, and what we see is an intensive increase in foraging by the surface feeding kittiwakes. We see the sand eels have moved up in the water column, and they've actually moved apart as well. The school is much more diffuse than it was before, which we think it means they're feeding. They're taking this opportunity of maximum ebb here. We're now above 85% of the daily tide and are feeding. And so what we also saw, though, and this is very important, is we saw evidence of internal waves that might be the cause of why this area is an important area for feeding. So we'll go on to that, where we realized then we have these hypotheses that, it might be we need these complex areas where the physics is pretty cool and it's mixing things up quite in a neat way with internal waves, which I'll show you what they are in a minute. Or it could be that it could be that we need the plankton there to attract everybody in, but it could just be the physics. So we set up an experiment with one of the best oceanographers, Jonathan Sharples. We went out to the Southern Celtic Sea and the Jones Bank, and we did our surveys around the bank. But then we also moved over some kilometers and did our surveys around a flat area to look at the difference between bank and flat to test these hypotheses. Because Jonathan had done earlier surveys, and we realized that these high levels of chlorophyll, so high green levels, really match up with shelf edges and sharp changes in topography, but are especially high over bank systems. And we really wanted to investigate that. And so if you're interested, we did all kinds of things there. There's a special issue, and huge numbers of wonderful people helped make this happen. But hopefully what I'm going to show you now is an animation that explains about internal waves and explains about these important areas of new primary production. So if this animation will run, what I'm showing here is that we had 80 CPs. This is putting a little bit of sound through the water column so you can bounce off the currents and come back again. And I'll play this a couple of times. And so what you're seeing with these lines is the line is representing speed of the tide, and then the direction is the direction of the tide. And that's on the bottom. On the top, what you're looking at is the thermocline, is temperature through the water column, about 11. Down below at the bottom, around 0. The oceanographer said 0 is the bottom, and then the top, it's about 80 meters of depth, with the top surface being about 16 degrees. And so I'll play that again. And what you see is as the tide is swinging around, you can kind of see the warm water above the cold water here. And the warm water, you can start to see the whole thing is swinging around. And then the warm water seems to really swing around fast. The cold water seems to be stuck. And then boom, it's called a hydraulic jump. That colder water all of a sudden comes over the bank. And then as you can see up at the top here, is that at that point in time, the whole thermocline moved up 40 meters. and then bounced after that. And it's just a massive amount of energy that's creating what's called a hydraulic jump, and then you get your internal waves. So how you can also see these is you can use your fish finders, your scientific fish finders, your EK60s, and turn up the gain really strong. And then you can see here the yellow is the colder water, the blue is the warmer water above. And then these fingers as another way to view how that internal wave is bouncing away. And you can see how it gets the thermocline right up to the surface. And then you see some fish schools in there. So it really gives us a mechanism by which these surface feeding birds are feeding on fish that should have been down, 30, 40 meters, and they are actually able to get them. And what it also allowed us to do is see that fish behavior is really at the times of internal waves versus when they're either neap tides or not so strong spring tides. And during the days as well, when fish schools are actually feeding, it looks like there's a lot more feeding going on at neap tides, and this becomes very important in a second. When I show you then, we were also on that trip looking, of course, at the birds and for the gannets, and I'll explain these complicated looking graphs here. So in the middle here's our circles going around our banks, and here is our circles going around our flat side. So this is the bank information up here and the flat down here. And essentially these are just lat long boxes with the number of gannets, right? You're looking at a map essentially of numbers of gannets, foraging gannets, feeding gannets. And what you see is during spring tides, you don't see a whole lot of gannets, but when you see them, they're absolutely feeding where that internal wave is banging away. And then on the neap tides, what you see is that's when gannets seem to be feeding. They seem to be feeding far more often out at this area, at least, when it's neap tides, which was really quite interesting. So there's both the use of the internal wave area. The internal wave is not happening during the neap tides, but they're feeding away in a range of spots. So that's a lot of information so far. So what I'll recap a wee bit is that hopefully you understand and agree that we need to work at an ecosystem level to understand cumulative effects. You've seen that offshore wind farms can change mixing and therefore primary production. So they are they're messing around with one of the main drivers of ecosystem functioning. But you also see that the areas of new primary production are driven by these differences in mixing. So the mixing at these internal waves are 3 orders of magnitude more than the surrounding areas. And that's where this new production of primary production comes through. So, and it might be then this place that creates these hotspots for predator-prey interactions. So it means all areas are not equal. So I'm just going to finish off then in this last few minutes of looking at examples of what we're doing then, of how to actually go about assessing this with wind farms and these new projects. And I first want to say then what's changed over the years since we last did those surveys is this incredible explosion of data, of collecting data via autonomous vehicles. And so what took us so long to do these surveys, and we haven't been able to do very many of them, they're so expensive, you have to have all those people out there and run all these things at the same time. Now we can run, because what was really important to get that information, to really understand what was happening, was collecting multiple data types, different trophic levels and physics, all simultaneously. Really hard to put that stuff back together, again, even with models. So now we've got gliders, we've got upward-facing platforms, we've got all kinds of things we can now use to collect things simultaneously, plus it's much lower carbon use by putting these things out. So I'll just introduce then now this project Pelagio, which stands for Physics to Ecosystem Level Assessment of Impacts of Offshore Wind Farms. And as I said, this is in this big NERC-led, DIFRA and Crown Estate funded project called EcoWind program. And then the top line is all of our academic partners, and the second line there is our project partners. So a wonderful array of group of people. In our work package 1, what we're doing is we're looking at the impacts of changes in mixing from offshore wind farms. And we're going to do this on 3 different scales. And the whole project is set up on these 3 different scales. We've got this local scale. Well, we'll be putting in these upward facing moorings and these gliders. In fact, we've already done it. They're in there now. And then we're going to look at a regional scale where our gliders are actually going over quite a few tens of kilometers, gathering data for all the months of the summer. But we're also then going to be modeling with our FVCOM, which is this very detailed oceanographic modeling that's coupled with a biological model, the URSEM model. so that we can go down to less than 1 kilometer. In fact, we can go down to the tens of meters so that we can incorporate the wind effects of each turbine and then work up to farms and such. And then we can also go to the shelf edge level. And because we also have to put this in the context of climate change. You know, you all know climate change is coming along so much. We have to see, yes, these are effects, are changes, but how are they compared to natural variability, and how are they compared to what's happening to climate change? In work package 2, we're going to look at the oceanographic processes and try to predict fish availability and see if offshore wind farms alter that. And we're going to do this by creating 2 new metrics we're calling prey availability and probabilities of foraging opportunities. And again, we're going to do that at these 3 stages with these upward facing moorings that look at fish and physics all at the same time that we developed in other projects. At the regional scale, again, we'll use talking about the gliders, but now we're going to bring in NEODAS data, satellite data on fronts and production. And also we're working with the RSPB and looking at tagged seabirds, and they've brand new, the MODIS tags. You can turn up, once you know that the bird is actually foraging, you can actually sample higher rate interactively. And then we've got a sister project being sponsored by Ørsted that's called Predict, where we're looking at the migration routes of all these pelagic fishes that I've mentioned at the beginning that are important, and a lot about their seasonal migrations, and we'll bring that information, that large scale information, across into this project. In work package 3, what we're going to do then is bring new methods of taking ecosystem level approaches so that we can look at cumulative effects and trade-offs. And we're going to then do this in these scenarios without wind farms, without fisheries, and without climate change, so that we can look at these differences. The reason we've gone for a dynamic Bayesian network model is where it's not a mechanistic model. It is a model that works essentially AI. It looks at patterns, and we've put into it 30 years of incredible data we've got in the North Sea already, start to understand the different regions and the different drivers in the different regions, so that we can take those predictions forward and bring in the new predictions from our FVCOM modeling to go forward. So also using this approach, because we can put the outputs into different things than just biomass, we can talk about ecosystem services and marine net gain and natural capital. And even we've got some work how we can do that, bring that right up to gross value added indices. And again, we're going to test this at different scales and figure out sort of what is the smallest scale you can run an ecosystem model at, and what is the sort of optimal scale to run ecosystem models. So our outputs of this project will be then these new ways of autonomous monitoring, combinations of techniques. So we can look at both far and fine field effects of the offshore wind farm, and also thinking about climate change within the modeling. In the output of work package 2, these fish availability metrics will hopefully give us a lot of reasons for why there's such differences in spatial distributions of fish to predators, and that can help a lot of the collision and distribution modeling as well that's going on besides our own modeling here. And then in work package 3, what happens with the ecosystem models is we can actually then look at all the different trophic interactions and then predict population trends, not exact, but whether things are going up or down or staying the same. And then, as I said, we do this all within scenarios where especially we're looking at fisheries displacement because of the large effect we think that will have on the ecosystems. And all of that then has fed through into the big, this fine scale stuff goes into the big ecosystem models to bring it back down into the fine scale of a wind farm. We're working then with the Stanford Natural Capital Project, the INVEST software, to actually then bring the trade-offs back again. So we hope this will improve our certainty in all those other models, as I've said, by better prey availability. We hope we can assess levels of change with ecosystem services and look at populations increasing. And we hope we can identify which areas via the interaction with climate change, wind farms might be helpful or harmful. And so that we hope that this all comes together. And so it leaves me to thank the massive number of people, wonderful researchers across the projects that we are collaborating with. And to finally then say as a conclusion, I hope what I've got you thinking about then is how to use ecosystem effects of wind farms, that it's not as complicated as a lot of people think, that it can be done, that we really need to understand actually the change in plankton, and that is going to help us right through the whole system, because that's going to help us about the change in pelagic fish growth, that could help us with things like whether wind farms are good MPAs and are they actually helping us with essential fish habitat or not, because we need to know what they're doing to the ecosystem before we say they're actually de facto MPAs or not. And as I said, that helps us with the change, predicting changes in distribution populations of our top predators, seabirds and mammals, but also really the sustainable future aspect, making the most use of our seas. We really need to be much more strategic, and some countries are doing it far better than others across Europe. This pre-strategic, but also focus now, these things are going in, focus on this long-term post-monitoring across these trophic levels so that we can understand both species and ecosystem level. This amount of monitoring, doing it properly, hypothesis-led, can really help us with our good environmental status as well. And hopefully then it's a win-win situation of working all together. And that's the end for me, and I'm happy to ask questions.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Beth? If you can stop sharing, maybe that would be good.
Okay. Go. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. That was very interesting, and you guys have done a lot of work, and obviously will be doing quite a lot of work. For those of you on the call, it will be, if you have any questions, please remember to put it into the Q&A at the bottom there. And while people are thinking of questions, because I think you've given them quite a lot of information, I think I'll start off. I think you've made the point about we need quite a lot of observations, and I really like your point that you can't just do it by satellite. That was quite an important message to come out there as well. But I wonder, and I see that you're working with Ørsted and other companies on this as well. So I wonder if there is more that can be done to make sure that, because these companies also take a lot of get a lot of data, and is there more that we can do to make sure that we can help their data can also help with parameterizing your models and making sure that data is available for everybody to use. That would be great.
Oh, it would be fantastic. And in fact, I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago at the All Energy conference in Glasgow, and everybody around me was representing developers, and they have come up with some fantastic ideas about sampling pre and post. And I was asking them, have they thought about sharing between developers, right, for best practice and stuff like that? And it was good to see them going, yeah. And absolutely, that's what we need. And I do see that's happening now. That there's a lot more talk between developers, and there's a lot more talk between developers and academics, and that hopefully the future, there's an acceptance, I think, in the developing developers that working together speeds things up. Yeah. It's that we're not, that a lot of the ecological community is not trying to slow things down. We are trying to speed things up. We are far more worried about climate change at this point, at least, and the level of wind farms coming in, than we are actually about the wind farm effects. That climate change is by far our worst enemy at the moment. Although if the wind farms get too big or too much, that becomes another trade-off. But at the moment, so we want to speed things up as well. We also want to know what's going on out there. And marine science, as we all know, probably on this call, has never been funded as well as it should be in terms of what it takes. But now all of these devices going out, they could be sampling. If we can set up, and especially working really early with developers, so issues like power, that we can actually have power from devices, or that the devices are powered. Yeah. Long-term sampling that way, integration in their information systems that they're sending back and forth as well. That the environment isn't seen as the last step after to get the tick for consent. That it's seen as something that's integrated right up front. I think that's what needs to be happening.
Yeah, but I mean, you mentioned that they work together amongst themselves, but also that they make the data and all that information available to the regulators and to scientists. And I think that I worry that if they're only working together, that still doesn't mean that it'll help us to manage better.
Absolutely. And there again, the paper I at the beginning of the talk, this cumulative effects, look, in there we very much point towards things like MEDN in the UK, EMODNet in the EU, as central databases, and the Crown Estate absolutely, taken this on board, that there needs to be a central database. There also needs to be quality control, because a lot of us have tried then to go back and get data. Developers have given us the data they have collected. A lot of it's then that, there's missing files there. Some of it is just not fit for purpose afterwards. And it's so annoying that the amounts of money that was spent and the data is actually not usable or lost. So yes, it absolutely has to, in the way forward, that there needs to be regulation on that more than there is right now.
I see we have lots of questions coming in, so that's wonderful. The first one is from Rory Hand, and his question is: do you think that floating wind is likely to have a reduced impact on the on layer mixing as a result of current disruptions, given the foundations are in most cases less deep and less rigid than the monopole jacket foundation?
Well, it's one of the really interesting questions we want to answer, because it doesn't have the monopole, but actually, depending on which type of floating device, sits very near the picnic line. Bouncy, bouncy, bouncy. Is it a little mixer? And there are some evidence already from some of the floating wind farms here in Scotland, possibly a really good plankton maker, because these are much more stratified areas. So we wish we knew, but it's such a sensitive play in stratification. We just don't know. So we do think floating wind is going to have an effect, just because it's in that very different habitat than the pylons.
And then the second question is from Cedric Bacher from Ifremer in France. How would you combine and model cumulative effects due to wind farms, so other effects like noise, contaminants, hydrodynamics, which play at different scales, so different spatial temporal scales?
Absolutely, our Pelagio project doesn't deal with that. There are other projects within EcoWind. Noise is one that's left out right now, and I'm certain that's going to come into the next round of funding. But those things need to come in as well. There are other projects called Accelerate and EcoWings, and I definitely recommend that. We're actually being, it's very different. Usually you get council funding, you go off, do your own thing. In this case, we have our EcoWind champions. We are integrated. We're constantly talking to each other. We're sharing across projects much more rapidly than in the past. So hopefully we will come up with some recommendations about how those things should be brought in. But at the moment in our own project, they're not in there. I agree, they're very important though.
I have to say, if I may just plug one here that is doing noise, actually, the MSP Challenge, which is a Marine Spatial Planning Challenge, which is a gaming software that is built on a food web model called Ecobot with EcoSim, is actually incorporating shipping noise and other things. And so there are softwares out there or tools out there that look at noise so far, maybe not as good as it could, but there's definitely ones out there that could do that as well. Okay, then the next question is by Yasung Hong. Could you talk more about the scenarios in work package 2? Are they linked to the changes of primary production?
We have moorings out that are looking at fish, physics, and plankton. And absolutely, that's what we're trying to see is, are there repeatable patterns of when fish are more available, i.e. either aggregated closer to the surface, and are those linked to physical conditions like we see with a little bit more oomph in the tides? Is it to do with where the mixed layer depth is, or how much plankton is available? Is it this neap tide where you get these bi-weekly increases of plankton because of just the spring neap cycle? So absolutely, that's exactly what we're going to do.
Yeah, and if I may, a follow-up question on that: are these scenarios? How far in the future are you working on them? Are you looking at a year or two, or?
We were going to go just to 2050 for realism, but we've been asked to go to 2100. And so we're thinking about that again. We're working across four projects now. Sorry, to decide, should we use contrasting ones, similar ones, different years? Because we're asking slightly different questions across the projects in EcoWind. So we did think 2050. We're also looking that we will be using the social. What's it called? SSP, the instead of just, worst case scenario, business as usual, the RCP runs, we're actually going to now incorporate the social runs and the equivalent physical changes in those. So we're moving on to using those. But we haven't actually, again, we haven't completely decided exactly which scenario we're going to run yet. We're still in the early stages there.
And I'm going to continue with following on from that again. If you are going even to 2050, are you considering changes in species distributions due to climate change, and invasive species, for instance, or?
And not invasive species, but exactly that. What we hope to use is our ecosystem output models give us the physical indicators of the distribution of our predators, top trophic levels. So we will move them around with those indicators and say, actually, with climate change, we do think like gannets will be over here, a bit more plankton, more plankton over here, and our pelagic fish might be a little bit over here because our fronts are now that much farther off, because not just climate change, but the wind farms might be moving some of those things. So yes, that we hope we run the FPCOM plus EarthSum models, put those through the ecosystem models, and out again into distributional models.
Okay. Again, then I'll go back to the questions. Laura Stockwood was asking, when will there be results from the Pelagio project?
Well, we're literally 8 months in. We just got our first kit in the water. But like I say, our champions are really asking us to pump stuff out as fast as we possibly can, possibly in reports and things like that. So yeah, these are 3- and 4-year projects, due to end in the end of early 2026. But there will be lots of stuff coming out before then. Actually, at the 18-month mark, we're supposed to have a big overview of what everybody's found so far. Everybody will have had their first field seasons already.
Yeah. Okay, next question by Edwin Verdane was asking, he said, thank you, very interesting presentation. I have to agree. And you're saying that plankton is the main driver, and he agrees, but he says in the Netherlands also benthic growth on monopiles can buffer these effects quite significantly. And what do you think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely. There's then a whole ecosystem on these pylons. And so the Accelerate project is very much more looking at that question. And again, we will work with them to see with our plankton, because we're looking kind of downwind, 10 kilometers or more away from the wind farms. I mean, some of these effects are predicted to be up to 70 kilometers away from the wind farms. So that's why we're trying to look then. So some wind farms are going to interact with other wind farms and stuff. So we're looking at those far field effects, not just the fine ones. So the Accelerate project will be looking exactly on those fine. And so will one called Bowie that's run by Martin Solon. We'll be looking more at those effects, and we'll try to integrate them.
Right. And then the next question is from Alessandro Cresci. He's one of our old young ambassadors, so that makes sense. One of our previous young ambassadors. Hi, Alexander, nice to see you again. Again, awesome talk. And he asks, do you think that the biological physical data that you have from the current winds can be used to train models to predict the impact of future winds? He says he thinks future floating wind will be of a massive spatial content. It'll be massively bigger than it is at the moment.
I completely agree with him. I think floating wind, my hope actually is all these wind farms in the North Sea are for the next 30, 40 years. And by then we've figured out floating, and floating is way offshore in huge lattices, each windmill being half a gigawatt, sorry. And working with people like Fergal Brennan and Strathclyde, that's kind of the answer. And then they're in deep water. They're still affecting a few things, but they're off in deep water, out of our shallow seas. But yes, absolutely, we can use. We really want to understand the mechanism of how these wind farms are affecting the physics. And once we know that mechanism, oceanography or physics is easier than ecology. Once you know the mechanism, if it's driven, by the changes in mixing and therefore densities and that water column structure, that can be predicted anywhere. Yes, absolutely.
Again, then the next question is actually from one of our DG Mare colleagues. Hi, Javier. He says, thank you again. How will the results from this study reach the public authorities, in particular in the changing, those that are in charge of consenting for? I guess he's asking for a friend.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So again, the money that came through, a bit of the pot of money went to our champions, and they are there to actually, and a lot of the people working in our champions, Dick and Howell is the lead there, is a former MMO person, a marine management organization. And so they very much connected up with all of the policy people of the UK, at least. And so we are then a direct lining to these policy people. And what I suspect is we'd all love to come over to Europe and also explain what we're doing, sort of possibly 2/3 of the way through our projects, and make sure we're aligning with policies in Europe as well.
Yeah, I think we should definitely talk about trying to get that done when you guys are ready. Okay, then Jonathan Barrington, actually, coming back to Shabiz's question, I guess there will be publications, but I'm hoping that there'll be some more non-scientific, or not non-scientific, but more science communication about it, than just publications.
Absolutely, we've all promised to do that. We've got a little bit like, if there's some really brand new stuff, it's like, you can't have it out in the public and then try to publish it. It's kind of, so there are issues about all the scientists involved and all their careers, because we have a lot of ECRs involved, and as much as we want to save the planet, we also want to save their careers, so that you have to, but we will produce more for the lay audience, what these outputs mean.
Okay. Then the next question is by Jonathan Barrington. You're focused on the subsurface ecosystem effects of offshore wind without considering the direct impact of offshore wind on the ecosystems above the subsurface used by flying birds. Are you matching the investment above? Is there also work happening above?
Exactly. So we could only do, to do it in this detail, we knew we could only do so much. So our stuff is the pelagic environment called Pelagio. There's another one called Eco Wings, all about the birds. So that's driven by CEH, Francis Daunt. And again, we're asked then their kind of modeling approach. We have some modeling approaches that meet in the middle. Our fish distribution modeling and stuff will meet up with the bird modeling, because the distribution models of birds and collision risk and all of that is most sensitive to fish distribution. If you change the fish distribution, you massively change the collision risk. So absolutely, it's not like we're ignoring it. We know that fish, as I said, seabird collision, massively important. But that project, who are specialists in seabirds, are doing that. We do have the RSPB with us, and I said that tagging study, the MODIS tagging study, absolutely, we will make a priori predictions of where we think, by our second year, where we think birds should be going that week, because it's either a spring or an eve tide. We think they should be more concentrated, this species over here and that species over there. We think we might be able to do that by our second year. So we're not ignoring the birds at all, but we're letting the EcoWind project look at collision risk and displacement of seabirds, and then we'll bring that together in our fourth year.
Excellent. Okay, next question. We've got loads of questions today. It's great. Yeah. From Eva Salvani, have you considered the impact on benthic habitats? I'm assuming there's another project looking at that.
Exactly. So exactly the same answer. So the Accelerate project and the Bowie project are far more, the Accelerate project very much about the movement of sediments and seabirds and animals that live on the benthos. And then Martin Solin's project, the Bowie project, is very much then looking below the benthos, the ecosystem functioning of benthos and stuff. So those two projects are dealing with those aspects. And again, we'll try to integrate across, because it really matters, how much plankton falls out and becomes detritus and affects the benthos in terms of food availability. So yes, but yeah, to do these really detailed projects with that amount of expert scientists, it's not like we talked to each other before, but we did do a bit of that, where we realized there would be projects probably coming in on these kinds of specialties. So that's how we've done it.
Yeah. All right, then the next question is from Marion Prof, again from Ifremer. She says wind farms have, or maybe Mayon, sorry, I don't know. Wind farms have already been authorized and built and are required to carry out environmental monitoring and produce a wide range of data. What recommendations would you make in terms of protocols for monitoring the planktonic compartment at the scale of the farms, so that the data can be widely used for research?
That's an excellent question. No, absolutely. We're finding here already, even the government people who are working within our project, who are on panels and talking to developers, who are doing scoping studies right now and saying, well, you've got to start thinking about mixing and plankton. And there's resistance. There's resistance because it's not been in the EIAs before, right? And it's like, are we just a bit of a pain in the butt that we're coming along and asking them to do even more? But we're trying to say to them, actually, we think this will speed everything up because you're so stuck right now at cumulative effects, you don't know what to do. This will actually speed things up and help you. So actually, how to do it? Oh, it'd be wonderful if, like, even when they put out the first buoy systems, you know, and the FLIDARs and their metmasts and things, to then hang off of those fluorometers, you know, so you can start to get a lot of before data. Again, trying to do it low carbon with things you can put out there. And then an insistence that, you know, whatever percentage of your pylons or your floating wind has an actual instrumentation on it. That's what I was saying before. If that instrumentation was embedded in and the power source was there, you wouldn't have to go out and if the data was coming back through communication systems, my goodness, what we could do in a very short order of time of understanding what was going on. So that would be idealistic to do that, but at least, yeah, some forms of monitoring. And now that we can run these little gliders, I mean, these tiny little gliders can go anywhere. You know, if they hit a windmill, bad for the glider, windmill won't care at all, right? So you could be sending these things through your wind farms as well. So all that stuff could be used.
Yeah. Okay, then Wineza Delusa asks, do you think the offshore wind farms can have the potential to facilitate algal blooms?
It depends what she means by algal blooms. Yeah, absolutely. One of the predictions is there'll be more production, but are they harmful alga? Are they very edible alga? That's what we don't know. So different conditions. So really stratified conditions, you can get a lot of coccolithophores, right? Not necessarily exactly what you want, as they suck up all the nutrients and not as edible. So yeah, we don't know. Yes, we do think they will enhance at some points. It's very complicated. It looks like from the modeling we've done so far on a temporal scale, during the spring bloom, it might bring the spring bloom down a little, but tiny a bit. So probably biologically insignificant. Post spring bloom, it might increase. And that's a point in time when lots of fish are, you know, looking for food. So if there's a bit more food, is it good food? Yeah. Don't know.
I guess it depends on whether there's the right nutrients around, because I mean, algal blooms by definition is something that's a very linked to nutrients runoff and those kind of things. So if there's no nutrients, then probably might not happen anyway. If there's nutrients, I would say, yeah.
That's why we think floating wind, that one of those first questions, when you're actually in the thermocline and you're actually got a mechanism that can pull some of that cool nutrient-rich water up into the thermocline. Yeah. So we think little hot spots around these things. Who knows? We need to monitor. Yes.
Okay. Haley Hinchin asks, do you think that there's an opportunity to use the understanding and new metrics from this work to evolve indicators for good environmental status under MSFD?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I don't know if we need new metrics, but at least I would possibly do, but absolutely to collect data for GES metrics we already have. Because again, going to developers and saying, go to ecosystem level, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. You know, there's this thing called good environmental status with its 11 descriptors. I mean, it's all there. Thousands of scientists worked on this for a decade. I mean, lots of good thought, and it's been improved and improved and improved. You know, it wasn't perfect when it came out, but, you know, it's getting better and getting better. There are agreed methodologies, you know, indicators and thresholds and all kinds of things that are already there waiting for us. Just we need the money to actually go out and sample. Mm-hmm. So I think actually just putting those two groups together, the MSFD GES group with the offshore wind farm, because I know here in the UK, it's trying to get those groups together. They're not really talking to each other, and because they're in totally different, you know, groupings. Yeah, that's what we need to do.
Yeah. Okay, and then Cedric Bacher asks, do you get some funding from private companies, and do they contribute to increasing observations? So automatic sensors and so forth. I think.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, the project called Predict is fully funded by Ørsted, which is one of the global wind companies. The contract we sign gives us absolute ability to do and say everything we want. They cannot stop us from saying anything. It's a wonderful group of people to work with. They decided some years ago, and it's not just us they're funding lots of scientists, that they just want to be strategic, and they're really helping out the entire industry by doing that. I really applaud them for doing that. And I must say, the project that I'm on is over halfway through, and they have been just brilliant. It's very nerve-wracking for a scientist to work with companies. I've worked with multiple companies. There's some I'd never work with again. And you always have to, that gauntlet of getting the work done, getting the science done, and here's where the funding is, and making sure that you're not being influenced by the company. In this case, anybody can go and look at our contract and see what we've signed up to do. We have full scientific availability to do and say whatever we're doing. So it's been a great opportunity, but you be careful working with companies. You want to make sure you've got that sense of freedom before you sign any contract.
Okay, then Jonathan Barrington again, he says it's difficult to accept the proposition that asserts offshore wind farms as de facto marine protected areas, given the subsurface and aerial collision risks, displacement and barrier effects to cetaceans. I guess it's not a question. So
yeah, it's a statement, but it's true. And the wind farm developers have been allowed to talk. They don't want to talk that much about de facto MPAs. They would rather just be wind farms. But there's been a lot of talk about de facto MPAs, and yeah, we don't have the proof whether they work as MPAs or not. We think that looking from this bottom of the food chain up and helping us to understand what they're actually doing, but as it's been seen, we need other projects on noise, we need other projects on collision to say, are these things really de facto MPAs, or are they just they're another anthropogenic pressure that's out there, but it has to be taken into account about the lack of bringing down of climate change risks and not using fossil fuels ahead at climate change predictions is terrifying.
Okay, and then the very last question is from Cedric Bacher again, saying that I guess there are some gaps in biological processes and coupling between physics and population dynamics. And do you identify some issues in model development with this respect?
Oh, absolutely. That thermocline and the mixing there, it's all chaos. And it's really difficult and to get it right. Best oceanographers in the world, we need more data about what actually happens in the real world. The textbooks may not be completely correct so absolutely there will be development. The oceanographers are very excited. The plankton people who are running the gliders and looking at the turbulence, especially how mixing is changing, are very excited to get this real new data, because yeah, there's things we just don't know at all.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that was it. I think the only thing that's left for me to say is if I can actually share the correct screen. There we go. Just to say that thank you very much, Beth. That was a great presentation. And to say that our next webinar is taking place on the 20th of July, and it will be on interdisciplinary collaborations with marine social scientists. So we will have 3 speakers, Tim Stoyanovich, Daniela Diz, and Tavis Potts, also mostly from Scotland, I think, because I think they're mass scientists. And I really look forward to having that interaction as well. But thank you very much, Beth. That was a great presentation and very engaged questions there. So thank you very much for that. And
well, thank you.
Yeah, I hope we'll be able to bring all of you over and to come and explain all your results sometimes to the people here on the other side of the pond.
That would be excellent. Thank you very much. Great.
Thanks.